Alrighty, well, welcome to session 2 of our watercolor workshop. So, plan for today is to build off of the, kind of worked on the left-hand side of the painting last week. Kind of got our background with the sky and the sky's reflection in the water started. So today we're going to focus quite a bit more on the right-hand side, and hopefully our paintings are going to start to take form. Right now they sort of look, they're in that awkward state, and so hopefully things will start to make sense and kind of come together. Before we do that, though, we have a new member who's an old member who's been with me many, many times. She's an old hand, but I want to let her introduce herself to you. Glad that you're here, Cheryl. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Couple of things. If you want to share where you are right now, this is totally optional right now, but if we can take a few minutes to critique, and during a critique, it's just a time for feedback, positive feedback, to get some suggestions and maybe some affirmations about where you are. So if you want to share, we'll go around the room in a moment. You can just pass if you don't have anything yet. Sometimes as you get further along, you'll get stuck, or you'll have a question, or you'll want some feedback, but we can certainly do some critiquing today. And then if you have any tips or favorites, something you found on YouTube, a new product, an artist that's inspired you, anything that you're excited about to share with the group, we'll give you a chance to do that in just a moment. And then we've been talking a little bit about another set of classes. So if you're interested, I may not be able to do any at all in April because of another commitment that I've got, but I'm looking at May possibly, and I'll try to avoid like Memorial Weekend, that kind of thing. But if you're interested, please let me know, and if we have enough interest to do it, I'm happy to. I would love to do another set of classes. I think it's a great way that we build off of what we get going. Sometimes it's hard to do this and then not do it again for 2 years. Like what happened during the pandemic.
It's no fault of anybody.
And so today, again, just a quick reminder, the 3 techniques that we're basically working with are wet on wet, wet on dry, and dry brush. And then within those basic techniques, there are lots of additional technical things that we'll talk about them when they come up as we go through the paintings. So last week when we wet the paper and then applied the pigment and let it do its blending, that was the wet on wet technique, and that's mostly what we did last time. Today we'll start with probably more the wet on dry technique, where the paper itself will be dry and then we'll apply pigment in a pretty wet brush. It'll have strong color. The reason we're doing wet on dry is because we're moving closer in the landscape. And so just a quick reminder, it's a little hard to see, but it's on the whiteboard on the upper right side there. What we're trying to develop here is some perspective with our painting, so that it looks like, it's closer in the foreground and it makes sense as the level of objects or clusters of trees and shrubbery. It's going to come lower on the plane as it gets closer to you. So in other words, the reeds in the foreground are very low on the visual plane. This group that we'll be doing today is higher, but not quite as far up as the group of trees that we started last week. So as you go from close to distant, you move up on the page and you typically lighten and dull your colors. That's not always true, but that's a kind of a general rule of thumb. So if you're finding today, for example, that your trees were too dark or too bright for what you want, this is the time to dull those down, and you can dull them by lifting the color a little bit, and the way to do that is wet it and then try a tissue first. If that doesn't work, try scrubbing it with a brush. If neither of those work, there are some other ways that we can do that. Glazing it with like the quinacridone gold, put a coat of paint on it and let that set for a little bit, and then lift again. We'll sometimes not only lift it, but color it with the glow. And we'll be using quinacridone or some type of a yellow to really try to get our focal point where the sun is kind of behind the trees. We'll try to work on getting that today. So those are the plans. One other thing is that I'm gonna do a demo of stretching watercolor paper with Kathleen's next painting board. If you are interested and you haven't stretched paper or you haven't done it for a long time, you can join me up here. Val's gonna video it, and then that'll be available too. So if you forget or there was a step you didn't remember, you can look back and we'll refresh your memory. So my tip, and this comes with a warning because there's a lot of graphic and really disturbing imagery with his work, but this artist is a Polish surrealist. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his name, but he's amazing. I don't really know what to say. I know Jeannie looked at some of his stuff. His life story, you couldn't make it up. I mean, it's a surrealistic tragedy when you hear his real life story, but his paintings are, I think they're disturbingly amazing. So anyway, if you're interested, check him out. Okay, so we'll go around the room and give you a chance. If you have anything that you want to share, critique, have questions, or pass, it's totally up to you. So for sharing. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with the demo. So if you would come up and join me up here, we'll go to our next step for today. So, last week we kind of started with this area on the distant left side of our paintings. And what I'm going to move to today, and I've simplified this quite a bit, but I'm going to sort of rough in these clusters of trees. So what I want to do here, the horizon line that I started with was about here. So I'm going to move down a little bit for this horizon line, which is going to be about right here. You don't have to be super picky about this. This isn't critical, but it is the idea of how to create some depth. And I want to reserve some white. So I've got some nice white right here. So I'm going to kind of move this little cluster of trees or foliage over to that side. I'm just going to kind of rough it in. And then I want a cluster that's a little bit closer. And so that is, these are leaves that are probably attached to one of these closer trees, but it worked well in the composition to just kind of do another group. And one thing I'm noticing right away with that sketch, the size of that is all very uniform, and I don't like that already, so I'm going to change it. Yeah, and especially now is the time to do that. And so again, with this one being a little bit closer, it's in front of this one, I moved that down on the visual plane too, so it just comes closer to you. If you don't do this, you get a painting that looks like it's in the fun house. It's something, you've seen them or it looks like water is flowing uphill, or somehow it's able to go at a diagonal. So you just want to be careful and just be aware that generally, keep these lines horizontal, especially when you're dealing with this kind of aerial perspective where you've got the river with the water. If you get some steep angles going with it, it's going to look really weird. Okay, and then down in here, I kind of simplified this whole setup because what happened here, the river was very low. There was a lot of rock showing. This was sort of where the water is sometimes, but is now just dirt. And it had some of the reflections or the shadows from the trees. So what I ended up doing was just kind of making this into a very, very sort of nondescript landscape. So I sort of had maybe a hillside that I kind of started with, but I didn't really work with it and develop it too much. Because what I wanted to do is have the reflection of my warm colors in the water down here, and then just keep this kind of foliage covered and maybe suggest some shadows from the branches. So I kept it really pretty simple. So what I'm going to do today is go ahead and get my paints ready. So surprise, surprise, I'm going to get quinacridone gold wet here. And then I want some browns. So I've got a whole variety. This Venetian red, I think, would be a good one. And I'll get some browns, so Van Dyke brown. So I'm just going to kind of condition these colors. This is yellow ochre. But my glow is for the most part going to be quinacridone gold. Maybe I'll put a little bit of cadmium yellow, or at least have it ready to go. Okay, so I'm going to position this palette a little bit better. All right, so wet on dry is what I'm going to go for. So the paper's dry, my brush will be good and wet. I'm going to really load it up. And it's got a lot of water, but quite a bit of pigment. And I'm just going to lay this in, recharge it with more pigment. And I'm going to go ahead and do the reflected color in the water.
Did you mix those together?
No, all that I have so far is quinacridone gold is all that I've used so far.
No. Okay.
Yep, just
Gold.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the easiest
Yeah.
way to spell it.
So now over in the area that's in the lower right corner here, it's sort of this nondescript area. I'm going to just play around with some colors. I've got Venetian red, kind of a brick tone. The Van Dyke brown is sort of a dull brown. I'm learning my palette, so I think Van Dyke brown is the next one over. Yeah, this is a brand new one to me, and I'm learning it. This is Van Dyke brown here. So I'm going to take those browns. So I've got Van Dyke brown, Venetian red, and burnt umber. So it's basically browns. And I'm going to go ahead and lay down, get some brown. Now that's very, very warm. And I don't want it quite that warm. So I'm going to go to sepia, which is right here. And sepia is the darkest hue of yellow, believe it or not. So I'm going to lay in some sepia. Now that's really strong, but it's remember that when you use a color, it's going to get lighter, and it's also going to be less bright as it dries. So I want the corner to be pretty dark anyway. And then as I come up here, I'm just going to kind of lay an undertone so that I can do some foliage over that later. Okay, so I really like what's happening here where the wet on wet now is starting to soften that edge. I have a real hard edge here, so to soften that, I'm going to grab a little bit of the go-to color, the quinacridone gold. And I'm going to soften this edge, so I put a little bit of gold in my brush. And now I'm going to go along that edge and give it a little bit of a glow. And then I'm going to take a clean brush and soften this edge a little bit more. So I'm going to kind of just come in. And this isn't critical. This isn't a real super critical part of the painting, but it does demonstrate how to kind of soften that edge, give it a little bit of glow so it's picking up some of the color out here. I might soften this a little bit too right now. So I'm just taking basically clear water and spreading that gold out a little bit. Spread the gold. Okay, so now I want to separate this. Okay, so I want the base of these clumps to be a little bit darker. So I'm just going to go back into those same colors, brown. Any brown will work. A dark blue, something like indigo. If you don't have indigo, if you happen to have Prussian blue is a nice one. That ultramarine blue is good. So I want this to be pretty dark down here. So I'm going to lay in some of this mixture of the brown and blue together. Another thing that will enrich in that and really make it dark is a little bit of that Tuscan red. So red, brown, and blue will give you a rich, earthy dark. And I want this to kind of reflect into this water, so I'm just going to kind of pull it down here.
So it was Prussian blue, Tuscan
Venetian, I
red,
think.
and
Yeah.
Venetian.
The Venetian red.
The Tuscan, I think you called it. I mean, the
Yeah,
Venetian
sometimes
you
you'll
called
see it
Oh,
as
Venetian.
Tuscan.
it was-
What is Venetian?
It's this reddish,
Oh,
rusty
reddish.
kind of brick
Right.
color.
Okay.
Brick, yeah.
Well, there was three of them. So
Yeah, it's
Russian blue, Venetian red, and
brown.
brown.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull this kind of, create this idea of the reflection here. And let the watercolor kind of do their thing. This is where the watercolors will work with you, usually, sometimes.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. And then you can also just, continue to lift. So I want to kind of reserve this shape. And I want to, again, kind of share it or show it again in the reflection. And, step back from your painting and squint your eyes a little bit to see if you're getting what you're wanting. So just spend a little bit of time kind of tightening up what you're going to get here. I'm going to come back to the quinacridone gold again and just kind of fill in a little bit of this area here with some of the gold. And quinacridone gold is really interesting because when you put it on full strength, a lot of this is just quinacridone gold on the trunks of the trees.
Color.
It can be a deep hue, so if you don't dilute it, it can be a pretty strong, it just looks like a brown. But when you dilute it, it's fantastic for glazing and creating these glows. So I spent a lot of time coming back over the tops of the sponge work that I did for the leaves with just quinacridone gold to give it this idea of the glow. And I'll show you how to do that later when we're ready for that step. But this is basically the next idea. So it's those two clumps and their reflection, plus, however you want to handle this lower part down here. One thing I do want to share with you is let's just do a couple of shadows, and then we'll, they don't have to be, you don't have to carefully measure where they're going to be. We're going to put some big trees over here, and just the idea that there are some shadows will make sense to the viewer. So let's just take some brown, and I'm just going to do a couple of streaks through here. And I'm going to lift a little bit. So kind of in between here. Might be a little too wet to be doing this, but you can do as much or as little lifting as you feel like you need. And I'm going to pull those shadows up a little bit further. So this was sepia, plus either the Van Dyke brown or the burnt umber. Any kind of brown will work. And then see where those blended together. Right now, if you want to separate them, it's perfect timing just to lift. And again, because this is on rough ground and it's going to have foliage over it, this doesn't have to be super detailed. It's just the idea. So that's kind of this next step. So any questions here? If not, give it a shot and I'll come around and check on you in just a moment. And come up close, come on up and I'll share with you how to get some textures into this foliage. Okay, so what I noticed with mine is that it's basically looking very flat. I'm happier with the value that I've got going here. I tried to lift quite a bit through here, and I kind of left. I happen to be able to leave a little bit of white on mine. If you don't have this little window here, it's not a problem. What you can do is lift some more, and again, the easiest way to lift is use a stiff bristled brush. And if you don't have a stiff bristled brush, I've got a whole box of them. And these are just cheap brushes because you're going to kind of scrub with them. You don't want to use your most expensive brushes. Plus, a lot of the, like these sable brushes are super soft. So anyway, just wet it with that stiff bristled brush and use a tissue. I've done this a number of times it'll work to a certain extent, and then you're going to be kind of as light as it's going to get. But that's getting there. So in here, I want to get some textures. And Frank's color palette was inspiring me. He had quite a bit of red in his trees. So I'm going into this Venetian red is what I've got here. And I'm going to go over, this is basically dry, this area that we did on the demo. So I'm going to lay in some of this rusty brick color. I'm also going to sort of stipple or dab a little bit, and that may or may not stay like that, but it's going to give me some options here. So I've got some red kind of laid in, and I did the same thing here already. It laid in some red. Okay, then I'm going to come over and I'm going to pick up some browns. So I've got a couple of browns that are rich and dark. This is burnt umber, and this is Van Dyke brown. They're similar. So a good dark brown. And I'm going to take my brush and very wet on wet, just kind of lay this in. And it's not doing a lot there. There's a lot of pigment in the red, so I'm going to go stronger. I'm going to go over to a blue, and this is indigo blue. Indigo blue with this red is going to give me a good rich, dark, earthy color. And I'm just kind of dabbing. And then I'm going to repeat that a little bit in the water. So I've got these dark browns, maybe a little bit of blue, dark blue. And then I'm going to go ahead and soften this out. I'm diluting the pigment with some water. And over here I need a little bit more darkness. So again, the Venetian red with a little bit of the indigo blue will give me a good dark color. And then just kind of diffuse it with clear water as you move out. Okay, so now I'm going to come back into this area where I laid down the original colors. And I'm going to sort of dab my brush to try to create some texture.
What was the second color you used after the Venetian red?
I'm mixing indigo,
Mm-hmm.
and I've used a little bit of brown too, Kathleen. Burnt umber or Van Dyke brown.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I'm liking this softness here a little bit better. This looks, this isn't exactly what I want up here, so I'm just going to clean my brush, and I'm going to move these colors around a little bit out towards the glow. So I'm kind of glancing at my reference photo, kind of thinking about what's going to give me that idea there.
Does the darkness come because it was the time of day that you were?
Yeah, it was. This would happen to be late afternoon, so yeah, I think the the sun was up here, so it wasn't sunset at all. But
And it
yeah,
was kind of cloudy then.
it was a little bit. Yeah, it was a little diffused light. Yep. So speaking of diffused, I'm just wetting that pigment and kind of moving it out towards this glow that I want here. But I'm also, again, still kind of not using a broad stroke, but kind of dabbing or stippling with the color. And then I want to soften the edge all the time. So while it's wet, I'm just going to lift a little bit along the edge. You know, this will also, I know you guys have been using sponges and tissues a lot to do this. This will give you some textures naturally. And then squint your eyes, step back from it. It might not be good to have just such a uniform lightness there. It might be good to pull some shadow in every once in a while. So like in here, let's maybe break it up a little bit. And just remember that a lot of this will be covered, of course, with the tree trunks and the foliage. So it doesn't have to be completed so that it's a stand on its own section. It's going to be covered. This is sort of the background. And if you have any hard edges, like this line right here is a little sharp, just soften it a little bit. I'm going to grab a little quinacridone gold to get this glow right here. I still feel like this is a little strong, so I'm just going to grab some quinacridone gold right now and lay it over this. Just kind of soften that up and tone it down a little bit. So I grabbed some more quinacridone gold here, and I'm just going right over these colors that I've already got here, and I can lift this, but that's a pretty dark area there. So anyway, I glazed on some quinacridone gold. Can lift it back a little bit. Step back, squint your eyes, and see if you're liking it. I want to get this reflection a little bit more obvious. So I'm going to grab some water and shape this up a little bit. I think it just kind of bled back together a little bit. Yeah. Okay, so that I just wanted to develop some more textures there. I'm sure that I'm going to come back to this spot and do more later, but in a few minutes after you guys have some time to do this next step, we'll work on the tree trunks, and that'll kind of be the next step. Okay, so where we are now is we've established the background and middle ground, so the sky and the reflection of the sky in the water. Background first, lightest value. And now we've moved forward. So last week we did this middle ground with our horizon line established through here. And then today we've moved forward with a cluster of foliage and just kind of established some sort of ambiguous looking groundwork over here. But what we've really tried to do is to reserve this glow. And this is kind of our focal point. What we really want to get in this painting is, this punched up area where the sun is going to be coming through the foliage, and it'll create some interest and the focal point. So the next step here is really going to be to work on getting some of these big tree trunks in here. Now I thought this was really interesting when I photographed it, and this is actually, this is the shadow from this down tree. But because of the composition here, I eliminated that, and I just used the artistic license of, making decisions about what's going to work. So we're going to do some tree trunks, and I think that's really going to help. It's going to make a big difference in this painting in a positive way. All right, so I'm going to start with two colors. I've got quinacridone gold, and I've got sepia. I'm going to start with the quinacridone gold. I'm using a number 10 size brush. You can use whatever size you're comfortable with. I'm not going to draw this out. You could definitely sketch this out. This area is roughly where I want to kind of start with some tree trunks. So I'm just going to pull the trunks up through here, and just keep in mind where the lightest area is, where the sun will be. And so I'm just going to kind of get myself started. And I'm not trying to make this look precisely like the reference photo. I'm using that reference photo just for a basic idea that I can use. So I'm going to do another tree trunk over here, or part of this. This may be a branch off of the same tree. And this is just quinacridone gold. This is going to work really, really well for my glow. And then later I can layer in that sepia and maybe even some other darker browns to get even more contrast. So now I'm going to move on out towards the corner. And that's very light. You can barely see that. So let's darken that one up, especially because it's further away from our glow. And this will definitely be darker later on too. So quinacridone gold, and then I just grabbed some of the browns that we had been using, burnt umber, and a little bit of the Van Dyke brown. And then I think I'll do another tree trunk. And then let's do some branches here. You might want to move down in size as you get into this. So let's go to an 8. And again, quinacridone gold. And just take a look at your composition and see where you think it needs the next layer of detail. Now, because I'm getting into the glow here, this is going to be important. So I'm just going to take the quinacridone gold. I'm going to kind of look at this one. I want to have some foliage that's going to be over the sky. So I'm going to start in here somewhere and just kind of layer something in like so. Okay, so now I'm going to darken these up. So I'm going to go to sepia. You know, this is a fun step because we have wet paint, and you can just, the pigment will follow the water. So just lay that sepia into those trunks and let it kind of work its way. And we can use gravity if we need to move it some more, but this is kind of fun to just layer it in and let it move around. And so what I'm trying to do is the lightest part of the trunk will be right where the sun is, and then just darken it as it goes out. So I'm going to actually add a little bit of darkness up here. And I'm going to go to a smaller brush still. Put a little bit of pigment in it and move this down. And this is getting lost right here, so I'm going to darken this little section right here.
Those trees make such a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this will really start to, I think you'll be less bothered by some of the places that seem dark in the background, because this is going to be the darkest value, so it'll make a big difference. And you can, you know, go as dark as you want. If you wanted even more contrast, you could even drop in a little bit of something like Payne's Gray into this, would really enrich in this. Let's do just a little bit of that. I have indigo, and I've got Payne's Gray. Let's try a little Payne's Gray. So I'm just laying the Payne's Gray right over that sepia. And then I have a sudden abrupt value change right here, so I'm just going to pull this out a little bit. But I want to keep in mind and just be aware of where my glow is going to be. And so I'm just basically cleaning my brush off and using pure water now to sort of pull this across that glow. And then, now these suddenly kind of start to make sense where you start to see some shadows there. You can do more. I'm not going to because later we'll do a lot of foliage here. But that's sort of basically the next step. Now, interestingly, in this photo, I got some of the branches that were overhanging from the upper left over here. So at this point, I know that what I should do, and I haven't done it yet, is have this marked off at 10.5 by 13.5, so I know precisely where it's going to be. But for the sake of the demo, I'm going to work in a branch over here. So I'm just going to take the sepia, and I'm going to come back in towards my focal point with a couple of branches. And these will be covered with lots of leaves. So don't fret and worry too much about all the detail. Just kind of get the idea in here.
So you're going to make it 11 by 13?
It'll fit an 11 by 14, Jeannie, but the mats themselves are actually shorter than that. So it's 10.5 by 13.5. It's basically an 11 by 14, but for some reason the mats are even smaller. They cut them smaller than that.
When they do that.
Yeah, I know it makes your
Yeah, you loosen that.
you lose.
Across it.
Yeah.
Huh.
Okay, so I'm laying in sepia. This is one of the most fun techniques in watercolor, I think, where you've laid down some water on your paper with pigment in it, and now just charge it with some more pigment, and it'll kind of the pigment will follow the water. Okay, so just a suggestion of a couple of branches on the upper left corner. These big tree trunks, and you can do as many or as few as you want. I'm sure that I'm going to end up doing more branches, but that's just getting myself started there. And I wanted those to be the darkest values that I have in my painting. So this is probably going to need to be lightened a little bit. I'm not real happy with the color here either, but there's adjustments that I can do. So just remember that you can lighten things, you can change the color. It will be dark over here on this edge, and I'll have that ready. I'll have it marked for the next class so that I can demonstrate, where to go with the shading there in the darkness. But that's the next step.
Cool.
Have fun with creating dark tree trunks.
Yeah.